everybody, my name is Saloni Doshi. I'm the CEO of EcoEnclose, and today we are here to talk about reusable packaging for e-commerce. It's a pretty sort of complex topic, and so we're going to break it down in a couple parts. First, we're going to talk about what is reusable packaging and how does it apply to e-commerce, because it's not sort of as intuitive as reusable packaging in other spaces. Then we're going to talk about how we would make a reusable mailer, and what are the different parts of it that you can customize, what kind of materials are used, things like sizing and custom branding. So we'll talk about that. Then we'll really tackle, and this will be the meat of this conversation, is reusable packaging actually better for the planet? Because it's not a straightforward answer, and so we're going to get into a lot of the data and analysis to help you understand if and when it might make sense for your business. We'll touch on some of the operational implications, and then we'll talk through next steps if anybody watches this video and they think, yep, this is definitely for me, where you would go from here. So first, what is reusable packaging? So I think we can all agree we're very used to seeing reusable packaging all the time. This is my handy coffee mug and my water bottle. I'm sure all of you watching have the same thing. You guys have reusable grocery totes. There are things that the sustainability community has been replacing single-use packaging with reusable packaging. We've been doing that for a while now, but I think in e-commerce it's a little different, and I think a lot of people say, like, well, how can we apply reusable packaging as a concept into the e-commerce space? And it's a great question. So here's what it sort of looks like today, and I think over time it may evolve, but today looks like, a lot of this is a common version of this is ours, this is the ReEnclose mailer, but this isn't that dissimilar from other reusable mailers you might find. And so the idea of reusable packaging in e-commerce is that you as a brand would ship the order to your customer in some sort of more durable material than a box or a plastic or a paper mailer. Your customer would then receive their order and they would ship that packaging back, either back to you or back to a network to be used. And so there's sort of three different models that when I think about reusable packaging, there's three different models at play. The first, and the first one is the most sort of obvious application, I would say, for reusable packaging. The idea is that a customer would send it back to you as a brand filled with things. And so let's say you have an apparel subscription business and you're shipping your customer some goods. I've got I'm going to pretend to be a customer. I've got my package, I've got a t-shirt, and I've got a really cool little Patagonia shirt, and I might think, okay, well, this is a subscription business and I'm supposed to keep one or two of the items, but I'm supposed to ship some stuff back. So let's say I decided I love this, I'm going to keep this, but I'm going to send this one back. And so you would, as a customer, I would take that, I put the item I wanted to return back in there. The company would have shipped to me with one label, and behind it they would put the return label, and I would put that return label back in. And then, if possible, we make our ReEnclose mailers so that you can right size them so that they can ship back a little bit smaller than they came for use cases like this. And so I would then, if it was USPS, I would put this in my mailbox. If it was UPS, I would just leave it outside for a scheduled pickup and ship this back. There's a lot of companies out there now that have a model where their customers are used to returning something back to them. It's, as I said, subscription businesses, clothing rental businesses. There are also companies out there where they are shipping products to their customers and they're saying, hey, customer, send me back your old clothes, your old phone accessories, or something like that. Send those back to me because I want to donate or recycle them. And so if you have any type of business like that, I would put you in sort of the Model 1 reusable packaging category, which basically just means that the packaging is going to get sent back to the brand full of stuff. And I think that's a really interesting use case. The second use case would be if more traditional e-commerce, where you basically just shipped your order to customers, and maybe every now and then you get an exchange or a return, but by and large your customers are keeping everything. So in this scenario, I'm keeping all of this stuff. Then what I'm going to be doing as a customer is shipping it back flat. And these mailers, our ReEnclose mailers, are designed to get as flat and sort of thin as possible for the lowest shipping rate possible back. In this scenario, I consider there being a Model 2 and a Model 3. Model 2 would be where the customer ships it back to you as a brand. And you as a brand are then responsible for receiving the mailers, making sure they look good, cleaning them if necessary, restocking them, and re-inventorying them. Model 3 would be if you work with more of a network. And so if you bought your ReEnclose mailers from EcoEnclose, shipped your orders out to the customers, and then the customers were to send them back to EcoEnclose, and we would sort of clean them, make sure that they're ready for reuse, and then reship them back out to you when you needed a replenishment of inventory. That would be model 3. It's more of a network model. And so that gives us sort of 3 different approaches to reusable packaging for e-commerce. Again, the first one is where you have all of this packaging that's reusable, you ship your goods out to customers, and they ship it back to you, typically full of stuff, because that's core to your business model. And model 2, you're shipping things to your customer in that packaging, and they're shipping the packaging probably most of the time, except for when they have exchanges or returns. They're shipping that packaging flat and empty back to you as a brand. And then model 3 is where your customers are shipping back the packaging empty, flat, but they're shipping it back to a network. So for example, EcoEnclose in this scenario. All right, so now there's a question of how is reusable packaging made and what can you customize? And I'll say for the purposes of this conversation, we're really talking about reusable mailers for apparel and other soft goods. We're not quite as much talking about reusable boxes. We can certainly make reusable boxes, but right now, based on our analysis that we've done, it's really difficult to make a reusable box that can provide the many benefits of a corrugated box and be as sustainable. And so I think for the purposes of this conversation and in the short term, we're really focused on reusable mailers where the sustainability benefits are there more easily and more readily. And so first, how is it made? Typically it looks a lot like a mailer, like a poly mailer or a paper mailer, but there's a lot of things that you can play with when it comes to sort of durability as well as sustainability. And so at EcoEnclose, we offer, actually let me look at these 3 first. We offer 3 different thicknesses. So we offer, and ours are all made with polyester, 100% recycled polyester. You can also make it, certain places will give it to you in a vinyl or an LDPE sort of material, but we really focus on polyester because it's fairly easy to make with 100% post-consumer waste. So most of that 100% recycled polyester is made with old water bottles, and we think that is a great sustainability benefit, and it's also a really durable material. So we also offer 3 different thicknesses for our 100% recycled polyester. We offer, the first is the thinnest material. It's 200D. Again, 100% recycled polyester. D stands for denier, and it's just a way to measure the thickness of your polyester. And the higher the number, the thicker it is. So this is sort of a great example of a 200D reusable mailer. It's pretty thin, but it's incredibly durable because of the way that it's seamed. So there's like a lot of cross stitching that allows for this material to be really strong. But for some brands, they might find it too thin. They might not find it to have the sort of customer experience that they want. And, certainly the thicker that you go, the more durable it is. And so this is an example of a 400D, 100% recycled polyester. This is our medium thickness. And then we also have a highly durable, this is a 600D. And you could tell that it's a lot thicker, a lot more like structured. And a lot of especially the more luxury brands seem to be gravitating towards this thicker one. So it's interesting, and you'll see this more as we talk about the sustainability. Certainly, it's probably common sense that the thicker you go, it is harder and harder to make it a more sustainable option than the poly mailer you might be replacing. And so as we work with brands, we really encourage them, hey, if you can make the thinnest version work, please use that because you're using a third or half of the material. And that's a really important part of ensuring that it is truly a sustainable alternative. So keep that in mind as you're trying to figure out what's the right sort of approach for you. Other things that we customize color. So here's an example of a gray mailer. Here's an example of a white mailer. We could do it in tan or beige, but a lot of people like that color variation. We also have this place where you put your shipping label window. Most people just love this simple design, but we can certainly customize that as well. Another thing that we can customize, we get a lot of questions about whether or not these are people like steal the goods that are in these mailers. They don't. From our research, we haven't found that theft is a big deal with these, but certainly if that was something that you were nervous about, we can customize it to have 2 zippers that come together and interlock, and you would put a zip tie in there if that's a big concern of yours. And then another question people ask is if you can custom brand it. And yes, we can basically do any kind of custom branding. We can digitally print it or screen print it. Here's an example of a reusable mailer that's screen printed. We can also do multicolor digital printing. We generally recommend more of a single color, just because it is getting sent back and forth so many times. You don't want such a rich and vibrant brand, like a big sort of color design on it, that you start to get uncomfortable if it gets dirty. So the simpler the design, the better. So another question we get a lot is around sizing and what sizes we have available. Right now, we're not stocking any of this. So you can't go to our website and say, "Hey, I want to get 10 reusable mailers," and to ship out. The reason for that is, as you'll see later, we think this is a complex enough product and packaging solution that we wouldn't want a brand to just sort of be like, "Oh, I'm going to start using reusable packaging," and not have a great experience with it. And so we actually ask you to contact us, and we start working with you to make sure we get you the packaging you need and you understand what you're getting and what kind of things you need to do to make sure it's a sustainable alternative. So with that in mind, we actually allow you to custom size whatever you need. But currently what we're finding is that we're doing all of the sizes that match our poly mailers. So this is one of our biggest one. It's a 19 by 24 inch. It's really big, and it's great for like a subscription business that's sending like 10 articles of clothing and then getting 2 or 3 back. And you can see that it has these snaps to right size it to smaller sizes. So that's our biggest sizes. And then we've got a lot of customers who are interested in using this 12 by 15, which is another really popular size. But we can do everything from the 6 by 9, which is the smallest poly mailer size that we have, all the way up to 24 by 24, whatever is the right sort of solution for your business. Another question that we get a lot is MOQs and how many do you have to buy? Frankly, right now, whatever amount you would want, we can certainly custom produce for you. What we'd say is that we don't really encourage people to get like 10,000 of these to start. The reason for that is because, as you'll see later, there's enough complexity that if you're a large brand and you want to switch over to reusable, you probably don't want to do that for your whole line. You want to pilot it. So most of the brands we're working with are starting with 500, maybe 1,000, 2,000, and gradually introducing it into their packaging and fulfillment line. But certainly if you're a small brand and you just want to do 5 or 10, we can definitely do that for you. Another final thing that I love it when people ask about is recyclability. And so if you can imagine let's say your brand and you currently use poly mailers and you want to move to this thick 600D polyester, you might think, okay, I want to make sure I'm not creating plastic waste. You might be worried, okay, my poly mailer is creating plastic waste. Certainly, you wouldn't be happy if at the end of its useful life this was landfilled, because then you might be creating almost as much plastic waste as your poly mailers were creating. And so it is true that a lot of the reusable fabrics that are out there aren't easy to recycle. We've been able to find a great partner that helps us with recycling our reusable mailers. So if you were to get a ReEnclose mailer at the end of its useful life, either your customer or you could send them back to us. And then as we get enough volume, we send them to get recycled. And the way they get recycled is depending on the exact type of material you use and their condition. They either get shredded up to be used as insulation, or they can actually get shredded up and recreated into a woven fabric. Great. And then another question we get a lot is about water resistance. And so these are a polyester material. Those of you who get like polyester jackets and coats and stuff will know that polyester is really durable when it comes to weather resistance and things like that. So we've really purposely designed mailers that can that are sort of hydrophobic, that repel water and repel dust and dirt as well as possible. It is important to know that these are like all packaging, they're getting tossed around warehouses and all of your distribution centers of UPS and USPS, and then obviously you're going to sit on the doorstep of your customer for a period of time. And so with all of those back and forth trips, yes, it can withstand water, but it will start to absorb some of the dust and the dirt. And so as we'll talk about in the next section where we really do the analysis on sustainability, it's going to be a really important thing for you as a brand to consider. How comfortable are you with that wear and tear and the scuffs that these mailers are going to get? You can clean some of it off, but you don't want to put too much sort of resources and heat and water into cleaning it, because otherwise you start to have an even higher and higher sustainability impact. And so you really want to start to understand, okay, how comfortable are you with the level of sort of scuff, dirt, dust, and wear and tear that these would go through as they go back and forth. So that's a great segue to the next section, which is really around this question of, are reusable mailers more sustainable than the single-use mailers you might already be leveraging in your business? And so for this, we're going to actually, instead of me sharing mailers, we're going to go through a set of slides so we can do a good job showing you the sort of quantitative analysis associated with it. Is reusable packaging more sustainable than the single-use mailers that you might be using today? Unfortunately, as with almost all questions like this, the answer is it depends. So over the next couple slides, we'll be talking about some analysis and what it depends on and some conclusions that you might make from the analysis. So the first thing, it's really important to assess, how do you measure sustainability? What is, for you and your brand, what does it mean to be more sustainable? And for us, what you'll find is throughout the next slide, the set of slides, we really focus on greenhouse gas emissions as the main way to measure whether or not something is more sustainable. We recognize that there's a lot of different sort of methods as well. And so keep that in mind as you're thinking about assessing this for your own business. So there's a couple different variables to consider when you're trying to understand, is your reusable mailer more or less sustainable than the single-use mailer you're trying to replace? So this slide shows some of the main ones. One of the first ones is input materials. So is your single-use mailer made with plastic or paper? How much recycled content is in your single-use mailer? How thick it is, how heavy is it? And then also on your reusable mailer, same thing. What material are you using? Is it recycled or is it virgin? Is it post-consumer or post-industrial? And then that second variable is weight. So for both your single-use and your reusable mailer, how much material, how thick is this material? How much, what is the weight of material that's being used? Another thing to consider is where it's made. If one of the mailers, your current mailer is being made in China, but the reusable mailer is being made in the US or vice versa, there's a carbon footprint associated with the shipping of that mailer that you really want to factor in. The fourth, and actually in some ways the most important variable, is the cycles. And so a question is, what is a cycle? A cycle is defined as a trip to your customer, for your packaging is going to your customer, and then back. And so that's basically one cycle. And this is ultimately the most important variable, which is how many cycles is your reusable mailer going through? Because if it's only going through 2 cycles, it's going to have a much less of a beneficial impact on the planet than if it's going through 50 cycles. And we'll talk over the next couple slides about how we consider cycles in this analysis and what kind of variables and factors actually drive your ability as a brand to maximize the number of cycles. So other things to keep in mind are cleaning. If you've got to clean that mailer every single cycle, like let's say every time it comes back to you, you got to do a deep clean of it. That's using heat, that's using water, that's using resources. That starts to increase the eco impact of your reusable mailer, and it makes it harder for it to be a more sustainable alternative. You want to factor in distance. So on average, how many miles does the reusable mailer have to travel back to you? And this is particularly important in a Model 2 and Model 3 scenario when, in Model 1, your customer is going to ship something back to you anyway, but in Model 2 and Model 3, they wouldn't. And so that becomes an added carbon footprint. And then end of life. And so we talked about this earlier. If you're currently using a mailer that's almost always getting recycled, but your reusable mailer, you don't have a recycling end of life opportunity for it, then that's something to factor in. So there's quite a few variables, but as you can see on the next slide, there's really 3 main ones: input materials, weight, and cycles. So, where it's made, the cleaning, the distance it has to travel, and the end of life of the mailers. Those are really important, so I don't want to downplay them. But as we've done the analysis, what we found is that the input materials, the weight, and the cycles are by far, the drivers of how sustainable your reusable mailer is. And so we have decided in these preliminary conversations that we had with brands, and for the purposes of this presentation, these are the 3 variables we're going to focus on. Things like cleaning and distance and end of life, they're more nuanced and they're more difficult to model, and you start to model them in, but they don't have that much of an impact on the end results. And so we really wanted to, for the purposes of simplicity, focus on the 3 that you see checked off here. So the way that we're going to go through this is to think about different scenarios to help you wrap your head around where it can and make a lot of sense to go reusable and where it may not make sense. And the way that we're presenting it, you can see this is scenario 1. The way that we really have started to think about it is, okay, let's think about your base case. What kind of single-use mailer are you using today? Then let's think about the reusable mailer that you're thinking of moving to. And then let's say, okay, on average, how many cycles does this particular reusable mailer need to go through in order to make sure that it has at least the same carbon emissions as the single-use poly mailer or the single-use mailer you're replacing? And the reason we did it this way is because, this helps you understand how you need to operationalize your reusable mailer in order to make it make sense for the planet. So in this scenario one, we're comparing a 100% recycled poly mailer, so one of our 100% recycled 12 by 15 inch, 2.5 mil thickness poly mailers, compared to a 12 by 15 inch 200D, so our thinnest reusable polyester mailer. And you can see in this slide that we're assuming for this purposes that they're both 100% recycled because we're comparing our two options that we have. We're also assuming that at the end of life here that we're just keeping it constant, that 90% of them are recycled and 10% of them get landfilled. And so when you compare these and you don't factor in things like return shipping and the carbon emissions of that return distance and cleaning and things like that, in this particular scenario, you need an average of 4 cycles. So you need to make sure that reusable mailer goes through at least 4 cycles, goes back and forth on average 4 times in order to make sure it has at least the same emissions as your single-use poly mailer. I think most people who are moving to reusable want to significantly lower carbon emissions. That's why they're making this change. So think about 4 cycles. It's like truly your break-even threshold, but you want to do much better. And so what does it mean to get 4 cycles? So the best way to think about it is to say every time you're sending a bunch of mailers out, you need to make sure that 76% of them come back each cycle in order to get to a point where on average each mailer is going through 4 cycles. And so that's dictated by whether or not it's actually returned by your customers. Are they sort of like looking at it and thinking, okay, I don't really want to do anything with this. I don't have time to return it back. And so maybe some customers are throwing it out or just stashing it into their own bin and not doing anything with it again. But you really need to make sure a high percentage of them are actually sending it back. You want to make sure that when it returns, it's not damaged and it's usable. It's a durable enough mailer to come back to you most of the time. And then that when it comes back, you are comfortable reusing it again. And so basically in each cycle, only 24% of your mailers can be lost if you want to get to an average of 4 cycles. It's also really important that you understand that this doesn't mean that you stop using your mailers after 4 cycles, because in order to get to an average cycle rate of 4, many mailers actually have to be used more times than 4. So this slide shows if you had, let's say you started with 100 mailers and you sent them all out, the reusable mailers, this shows, okay, well, this first bar shows that 24% of them or 24 of them will only get used once, because in the assumptions we made just before, what if only 76% of them get sent back each time? So if that's the case, then 24 don't only get used once, then 18 of them get used twice. Another 14 of them get used 3 times. And so you can see in this chart how many out of the whole batch of 100 get used each amount, have these different cycle rates. And what you can see is that many of them will have to go and be used 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 times in order for the average across all of those 100 mailers to get to 4. And so I describe that to say that it's really important that you as a brand feel comfortable with the fact that many of your mailers will have to go back and forth 9, 10, 11, 12 times. And you've got to be comfortable with what that means from, again, like a dirt and a wear and tear perspective. And ideally, you're not just comfortable with that, but perhaps you're even really proud and that you're like, okay, I'm really proud to be sending a mailer out after it's been used 12 times. And you want to actually get as many of your mailers to that cycle rate as possible and be okay with what that means for the customer experience. And again, maybe it's like a source of joy and pride for your brand to be able to have such a worn mailer be sent back out to your customers with their orders. So that's scenario 1. Scenario 2 is, okay, well, what if we were looking at the thickest mailer that we have? So 100% recycled poly mailer versus 100% recycled reusable polyester mailer. But in this scenario, instead of the polyester mailer being 200D, it's 600D. And so it's a much heavier mailer. And in this scenario, you need to get to an average of 9 cycles in order to get to a break-even emissions. And so here you can see that it means that many of those mailers then have to get used 9, 10, 11, 12, up to 30 times in order for you to achieve that average cycle rate of 9. Scenario 3 is, okay, well, what if you aren't actually using 100% recycled mailer on the reusable side? You're going from 100% recycled poly mailer to a virgin reusable mailer. And in this scenario, you have to get to 22 cycles that are needed for break-even emissions. that's the scenario we laid out here. You can imagine that the alternative is also true, that if you were going from a virgin poly mailer to 100% recycled mailer, then much fewer cycles. That recycled content has a really big impact on whether or not, what you're moving towards is better or worse. And then scenario 4 is, okay, well, what if you're using a paper mailer and you're thinking about moving to 100% recycled polyester mailer? And in this scenario, we modeled basically a virgin craft paper mailer that's 15 points thick. So a fairly thick paper mailer that's 12 by 15 against a medium thickness reusable polyester mailer, so that 400D version that we offer. And in this scenario, only 1.5 cycles is needed to break even. That means in this scenario, only 33% of them have to get returned back each time to make it carbon neutral, to switch from one versus the other. So what you can see here is that, it depends, right? It depends on the answer to whether or not reusable is better in the e-commerce world. It does. It depends on a bunch of things. And so a couple of conclusions I think we can make is that if you have a Model 1 sort of business where things are already getting sent back from the customer to you as a brand, it is very often true that this is going to make sense because, likely 90 to 100% of your mailer or your customers are going to send something back. They probably are doing it already. You do need packaging for the return trip. And I think customers in this scenario feel like they're part of your community. Maybe it's a subscription business, or they just feel like they're part of something, and they might really appreciate the brand proposition of having reused, slightly worn down mailers getting sent to them. If you're in that Model 2 or 3 place where customers by and large are probably shipping something back or shipping the packaging back empty, I think that's where it needs a lot more analysis. And we love working with brands like yours. If you're in this boat and you're like really intrigued by reusable packaging and you want to figure out if and how to make it make sense for your business, we'd love to help you with that. So here's where I think it's not necessarily a slam dunk, and we'll work with you to figure out, okay, how can we make it make sense? How can we make sure that your customers are going to send it back at a high rate and that you feel really comfortable sending out used packaging back to your customers so that you can get to cycle rates of 4, 9, 22, whatever is needed for your particular business. And then I think another thing to keep in mind is that if you use paper, and a lot of brands have moved from poly mailers to paper in an effort to cut down on their single-use packaging or their single-use plastic packaging. And I think in this scenario, a 100% recycled polyester reusable mailer could be a really interesting alternative because it doesn't take much to make it carbon neutral, the switch. And, after 3-4 uses, it actually becomes much better for the environment. And it allows you to, frankly, stop sort of drawing, I think, on the highly constrained paper supply and potentially sort of moving to something that may even be more palatable to your customers. So I think if you're currently using a single-use paper mailer, it's a really interesting alternative. So if you've done some of this thinking and analysis and you've sort of come to the conclusion that, like, hey, reusable packaging could make ecological sense given my business and my business model, I think the next step is to remember that it has some pretty important implications on your operations, and we wouldn't want you to forget about that, and we'll definitely be partners in walking you through that process. So a couple things to keep in mind, and there's many, but a couple things we really want you to start with when you're making this potential transition is, first, consider how you purchase and inventory your packaging. And so the way that a reusable mailer is significantly more expensive than a single-use mailer because it is durable and it's meant to be used multiple times. Generally, it's priced, anywhere from 4 to 10 times more than a single-use mailer that you might be using. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. So not only do you need to use it 4, 9, 22 times sometimes to make it break even from a greenhouse gas emissions perspective, you also need to make sure it gets used that many times from just a cost management, making sure that you're not moving to something significantly more expensive. So that's important. And the way that people purchase reusable mailers could be different. Some people will purchase it outright. Some people will lease it, and they'll say, okay, well, I'm going to get 500 mailers, and I'm going to buy them from you at $1 a month or 50 cents a month. And that is more of a subscription approach to these reusable mailers. And then some people might use it per cycle, and they might say, okay, well, I'm going to use it for every X times it gets sent to and back from a customer. It costs this much money. So there's a bunch of different ways to purchase and to charge for reusable mailers. And then the other thing to keep in mind is how you inventory it. So if you're using single-use packaging, it's very straightforward. Maybe you're going through, let's say, 1,000 mailers a month, and then when you get to having 200 left in your inventory, you're like, okay, I got to go buy some more, and it just comes. In this scenario, you want to be thinking, you start to have to track data. You have to say, okay, well, I know that there's 1,000 mailers that just got shipped out, and I expect to get 800 of them back, and I've got 200 in my inventory, and so I'm good. Or you might think, okay, based on the return rates I'm seeing and the amount I have in my inventory, I need to purchase more. And so there definitely is an added complexity to how you manage your inventory. And I think this is where getting a preliminary baseline sort of set of data with the pilot is really helpful so that you can manage your packaging inventory really well. So that's something to keep in mind. The other is your fulfillment operations. This has a big impact on your fulfillment and warehousing team and how they get used to receiving packaging that's coming in, what they do with it if they have to clean it, and then also how they fulfill the orders. And particularly, they've got to get a return label out with every order. That might not be the case already. They might need to choose between reusable and single use. Some brands out there are actually putting on their checkout, hey, if you want me to ship you your order in reusable packaging, check here. And sometimes customers are even willing to pay an extra $1 or $2 for that service. If that's an approach you're taking, then your fulfillment team will need to know which of your customers wanted reusable packaging and which ones of them wanted single-use packaging. You'll want to consider space and storage. And so depending on how you go about doing this, you might need a little bit of extra space, particularly early on, to house all of your single-use packaging because it is thicker and does take up a little bit more space. You'll want to train your customer service team because they'll probably get a lot of questions if customers are getting reusable packaging for the first time. Yes, there's going to be a lot of messaging on your packaging and maybe in your packaging, but you'll want a customer service team that's adept and ready to answer the questions that they might get. And then finally, I think recognizing what are the implications of this on your brand, on the customer experience, and really being ready to communicate it as a point of pride and a point that bolsters your brand rather than something you have to apologize for. If you're going to start sending out things in slightly scuffed up mailers, how do you make that something that actually your community, rallies around and not something that you have to explain or apologize for? So there's tons of different operational implications, but if you sort of think through these 5 to start and you feel really good about both the sustainability impact of going to reusable and your ability to manage these operational implications, then I think your next step is ideally to say, okay, let's get started. And what I would ask you to do is email us at hello@EcoEnclose. And what we'll do is start to understand what is your business model? How do you want to use these reusable mailers? What kind of reusable mailers probably work best for you? And we'll start to work with you to design a pilot where we can get you a small set of them. You can start using them in your operation, and then we'll help you analyze your data to make sure it makes economic and ecological sense. And as you get that data and you feel really comfortable with reusable packaging, we just start ramping up your production and making sure that you have enough reusable mailers to meet more and more of your business operations. So I really hope that this was a helpful session today and that you learned a lot about reusable packaging when it comes to the e-commerce space. If you have any questions, reach out to our team at hello@ecoenclose.com. Again, this is Saloni. So my email address is Saloni, S as in Sam, ALONI @ecoenclose.com, and you're always welcome to email me directly. Thank you guys so much. I really appreciate being part of a community of folks that just cares so deeply about how they ship and how they do all parts of business. Thank you.